Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Lord Kirkhope, who's a former UK immigration minister. He's also a former leader of the Conservatives in the European Parliament. He gave me his reaction to the Prime Minister's speech tonight.
I'm speaking now as a former immigration minister, and I made a speech on the migration bill, literally this last few days, in the House of Lords, in which I called for a more international approach to the whole question of migration and, indeed, the whole question of asylum seekers that are currently bombarding the whole of Europe, not just our country across the Channel, but also countries like Italy and Greece and Malta, who've been bearing an enormous amount of responsibilities in relation to these things. And I was arguing, and I think this seems to be the way the Prime Minister is now going, which I'm delighted about, and that this is not something that can be solved by one country alone. Even an important country like our own, outside of the European Union, we now need to go back to our former colleagues in the European Union, and we need to work together to get a solution to these pressures.
But is there a bit of an irony here, Lord Kirkhope? Because, as you point out, we've left the European Union. I mean, is there going to be much sympathy for Rishi Sunak's plea for international cooperation when it comes to other European leaders who've got enough problems of their own on their hands?
Yes, well, I mean, I'm one of those irritations that is a Remainer, because I was one of the people when I was in the European Parliament, for instance, I drafted the Dublin Agreements, which were the agreements that allowed for the removal of people to other countries in Europe, sharing of the responsibilities, shall I say, when it comes to asylum issues.
But now we're outside the EU. Isn't it going to be much harder for Rishi Sunak to get the sort of cooperation that he's been asking for?
Yes, it is going to be harder. Inevitably, it's harder because we're not in that process anymore. But the European Union has showed a willingness, and it is important because we are a major player here. It is important that we actually do work together. And if the UK is prepared to discuss with European nations and work on some kind of wider kind of approach to this, then I think we can, to a large extent, achieve that fifth aim of Rishi Sunak, which is to stop the boats. I mean, we need to do something quite radical here, and I'm very pleased that at least we're getting a start with it. And I hope the European Union is going to respond positively, and the signs are, as of this evening, that they are.
So what about this question of the European Court of Human Rights? Rishi Sunak has had a meeting on this as well. He's asking for changes to stop those rulings which prevent the deportation of some asylum seekers. It doesn't sound as though he's going to get what he wants there.
No, I mean, I think the difficulty is the Rwanda element of this is the one thing that really, in my view, is not going to be achievable. And I have argued very strongly, as I said, as a former minister, that Rwanda just doesn't work because it inevitably projects us into a situation where we're going to break international law. And as a former minister and indeed a lawyer, I'm not prepared to support, and a lot of other people are not prepared to support, the breaking of international law. And I think we're just going to have to accept the fact that unless we can get an international agreement regarding the question of where people are processed from the point of view of asylum, and how we're going to deal with this influx, unless we can get that in place, then I think it's going to be very difficult for us to try and promote further that Rwanda deal.
Well, the Prime Minister has made it very clear that he's prepared to press ahead with that bill, which would give ministers the right to ignore some of those ECHR rulings.
Yes, well, he can press ahead with it, but I'm afraid that, sad though I am, because I think actually the initiatives of the Prime Minister now look quite encouraging, except for this point. We now have in the House of Lords that bill, and there is no doubt that we're going to do our job. We have to do our job. We're going to scrutinise it carefully. We're going to suggest amendments to it. And I'm afraid that some of those amendments are going to not necessarily fall in line with the Prime Minister's priority.
Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, talked yesterday about how the levels of net migration to the UK are unsustainable. The Times is reporting tonight that many of the proposals that she has drawn up to try to address this are being blocked by cabinet colleagues. Things like increasing the minimum salary threshold for skilled workers coming to the UK, reducing the amount of time foreign students can stay here and so on.
Yeah.
Do you think she's right to press on these sorts of issues?
Look, the situation about migration as opposed to asylum, and these things are separate. Unfortunately, the government doesn't always seem to understand what the separation is. As far as migration is concerned, as opposed to asylum, it is entirely in the hands of the government as to how many people they allow to come to this country and for what purposes. Now, she is talking about reductions right across the whole pitch. The problem is that we do need immigrants and we do need people in specific areas. We've lost an awful lot of Europeans, particularly in the health service, social services and the like. It's very sad that we have. And I think we've got to address that point again. We've also lost a lot of people who work in the agricultural sector, although the Prime Minister has promised this evening to increase the number of people that will be allowed to come here for seasonal work. And that's a good thing. I welcome that. The Prime Minister is clearly taking, in my view, a sensible approach. I'm not so convinced that the Home Secretary is playing this game right. I think she's trying to have her cake and eat it, as it were, and that's not going to work. I think we've got to have a particularly sensible approach to immigration, and it's not going to work if it's, loaded down with lots of rhetoric from the Home Secretary. I think she's out of line at the moment, and I hope that the Prime Minister's approach to this, which seems more pragmatic and more sensible right now, is the one that will prevail.
Do you think this is just Suella Braverman positioning herself for perhaps a future leadership contest?
Oh, I'm so sick of future leadership contests. In fact, I'm sick of previous leadership. I'm sick of all this nonsense. What really has to happen is that the government has to settle down. The Prime Minister has to be pragmatic and sensible, calm things down, and we've got to behave in a sensible way. If we do that, then we've got a good chance of winning the next election. But if we're constantly being sort of hassled by rhetoric from individuals who seem to fancy their chances of knocking Rishi out or coming in as a new leader of the party, these silly conferences that are going on with right-wing groups and so on. I mean, all of that is a complete distraction. What we need to do now is to get down to the business we need to do, save the economy, improve the lot of everybody in the country, and be sensible about things like immigration and asylum.
Well, that was Lord Kirkhope, who's a former British immigration minister. Let's